Hey guys, what's up? Today you're about to meet 10 JRPGs that are really hard to get into, very complicated. Whether the fact that these games are good or bad, that's entirely up to you. But what they all have in common is that they are JRPGs that are just not for everybody. So with that in mind, let's begin! Number 10. The Generation of Chaos series. This is a series of strategy RPGs we met on the PSP when some of them were finally localized. The first one, simply called Generation of Chaos, is actually the fourth one in this series. It revolves around the micromanagement of your main characters and their armies in order to conquer territories and win the war. This game received a sequel now called 80s Eclipse, which was also released on the PSP. Both games have very similar gameplay mechanics, but with a very steep learning curve. You start in these long maps where you already own a certain amount of territories. You need to advance on a limited grid-based system with your characters to occupy new areas and defeat your enemies. During battle, you command a whole platoon of NPCs in an all-in-all versus combat, which ends up similar to a real-time strategy game. They're both really hard to get into, but once you get the gist of them, they can either become a pleasant experience or a never-ending nightmare. There's also Pandora's Reflection, which is the sixth one in the series, and it plays vastly different than the others. Here is just a plain real-time strategy RPG with characters being commanded to move around the map. However, it's basically the same idea as its predecessors. These games are great in my opinion, both gameplay and story-wise, specifically Pandora's Reflection, which was digital only. But I understand they're really hard to grasp, something that makes them RPGs that are just not for everybody. Number 9. The Agarest games. The Agarest series is another franchise by Idea Factory, but this time involving the kings of fan service, its subsidiary Compile Heart, into development. These games are total grindfests as they're strategy RPGs all the way, combo driven, and with generations of characters one after the other. The first in the series, known as Record of Agarest War in North America and Agarest Generations of War in Europe, is one of the longest RPGs of all time. You get into a 10 to 15 hour period with each generation of 5 different protagonists, so imagine just how long it is. Considering it's also an extremely hard title where you'll be grinding over and over again, each arc story can become its own game. There's 3 games in the series so far, and also a spin-off called Marriage, but that's a turn-based RPG for PC and I've never played it. Since they're Compile Heart games, you can already imagine the amount of sexualization there is into them. They actually went overboard with these games since they are also dating simulators where you choose one of the heroines to marry and have sex with in order to have a male child who will become the main character of the next generation. Yeah. In the end, these games are brutally hard, difficult to get into, and because of that, and the overly exaggerated fan service, I'd say they're just not for everybody. Number 8. Brigandine, Legend of Forsena. Speaking of strategy RPGs, here's another one with similar concepts as the Generation of Chaos series, but being just a turn-based tactical game through and through with no real-time mechanics. You choose between several different routes, each with their own main character, so you can embark into a journey of conquest or liberation. All this surrounding a major war with soldiers and monsters of all kinds included. However, The game kinda throws you in with no explanation whatsoever, which means you're on your own trying to learn the overly complicated gameplay this RPG has to offer. I strongly suggest you follow a guide if you decide to play it, because it's totally worth it as it is a hidden gem on the PS1. I'm not the biggest fan of it, but I think the game has a lot of potential and plenty of replay value. It's just a matter of properly understanding what to do in order to succeed, especially with some routes that can be pretty confusing to follow. If we add the fact that there's also a lot of micromanagement involved, it only gets worse if you don't know what to do. Overall, it's a solid game that I recommend if you're looking for a real solid challenge. Just do yourself a favor and read a walkthrough. Number 7. The Ogre Battle Games. We're not done with micromanagement, wars, and strategy RPGs, but I promise this is the last one. I'm not the greatest fan of this Dead franchise either, but I did enjoy both titles in the series to a certain extent. There's March of the Black Queen on the Super Nintendo, which was later remade on the PS1. Then we got Person of Lordly Caliber on the Nintendo 64, one of the very few RPGs released on the system. These two games play very similar. You have a bunch of characters at your command, divided into small parties of both soldiers and monsters. The goal is to either conquer or liberate some territories on these really long and big maps. Once your characters make contact with an enemy unit, this turn-based system starts where you have no direct control of anything. Strategizing and micromanagement your units beforehand is the key to affecting these battles and win them. The Ogre Battle games are amazing, totally hidden gems, and they certainly deserve your attention if you want something complicated and hard to get into, although not as complex as all the previous titles in this list. Number 6. Phantasy Star 2. Strategy RPGs are not the only ones that can easily become huge and tedious grind fests, you know. Some turn-based RPGs, mostly classics from the early 90s, are quite the chore to get into. Phantasy Star 2 is one of the most infamous RPGs because of the grinding seasons. The moment you start the game and go outside your first town, you need to grind to have at least enough money to buy your second character a weapon. You also need to do that in order to prevent total annihilation from your first random encounters and avoid healing over and over again, which you'll be doing quite often anyway. These are very repetitive and often on certain areas and can be a pain in the ass if you don't want to grind anymore. But anyway, leveling up is a part of any other RPG, regardless of how much you have to do it. However, what makes this game take the cake of its own infamy are the dungeons. They are simply impossible to navigate without a guide, or without a shitload of patience. This RPG was originally sold alongside a walkthrough because even the developers themselves knew how hard it will be to actually complete it. They're full of encounters, dead ends, and not a single one of them have a map, so you can already imagine the frustration. Alas, Phantasy Star 2 is still a good game, and I enjoy playing it every once in a while, but it's just definitely, for very obvious reasons, not an RPG for everybody. Number 5. Final Fantasy Type 0. This game was first developed and released for the PSP only in Japan back in 2011. 4 years later, it was fully remastered in HD for modern consoles. It's an action RPG that's quite messy, really hard to understand, and just plain annoying to follow. I say this precisely because even though there is a deep story involved, with a very intense introduction by the way, the game throws you in so violently against its characters and battle mechanics. Everything is explained, and there's an entire tutorial at the beginning of the game, but it's not properly elaborated in my opinion. Also, it just feels as if the developers were trying to make the characters and the cutscenes look cool, while forgetting to make an enjoyable gameplay. Some of them are pretty forgettable, and they're just full of boring cliches. Camera is absolutely horrible here, and the hit detection is so bad, So bad, it can make the game unplayable at times. Well, some people love this game and some others hate it. I am somewhere in between because I did like some things such as the soundtrack and the HD progression. But to be honest, it's not something I can recommend to anybody, although it will be ideal for you to try it out and decide for yourself. It's not a bad game by any means, it's just an RPG that's, well, not for everybody. Number 4. Shin Megami Tensei Strange Journey. Out of all the Shin Megami Tensei games that have been localized outside Japan, Strange Journey might be among the hardest to get into. It was first released on the Nintendo DS and it became one of the most difficult RPGs there for one main reason. Later, it was ported and partially remade for the Nintendo 3DS, where it became much more playable and enjoyable. However, both versions share the same outrageous motive that pissed off a lot of people: the maps. Traversing through this game, as it is a first-person dungeon crawler, can literally take forever in some areas. They're just too damn long. It's as if they were never-ending labyrinths that can just go on forever. Now imagine trying to get anywhere in this game, coming across many dead ends and traps, all these with random encounters all around them. It's madness. Nevertheless, everything else in this game makes up for that. You have the classic gameplay mechanics such as the turn-based battle system, the demon recruitment and negotiation, an incredibly deep and well-written story, adult-oriented, and a killer soundtrack. Playing this game, despite its traveling nature, just feels great, and you'll love it if you're looking for a long trip full of challenge. It's definitely one of the best Megami Tensei games, a game that I really like, but I understand it's just not for everybody. Number 3. The Last Remnant. I know there's a remastered version on the PS4 and the Switch, but I've never played it. The original on the Xbox 360 is the one I played, to a tragic demise. Before I took on the controller, I was aware of the strong criticism towards it, but not aware of all its technical problems. At first, I enjoyed the heck out of it because it was a total mess, but in a good sense. I was just having fun going through this initial tutorial where everything is explained, and I found it extremely complicated to understand. Nevertheless, I was winning! I realized I didn't even need to grind in this game at all, and just plain follow my wits, strategizing a little bit here and there. Overall, my first 10 hours of gameplay were just great, and I was still wondering why a lot of shit had rained down upon it. Then I came across one of its major technical problems that completely ruined the experience for me: difficulty spikes. I came across some bosses that I couldn't defeat, so I went and grinded for quite a while, only to realize it changed nothing to my favor. It was then where I found out how poorly designed some areas were, like not being able to choose a specific action for most of your characters. The RNG is horrendous. The battles can sometimes take too damn long, and the story, although very well written, is kinda ruined by one of the worst protagonists I've ever seen in a JRPG. The Last Remnant is far from being a bad game. I just couldn't really get into it. I thought I did, but in the end, I realized I had been incorrectly playing this game. Maybe someday I'll give it another chance. Maybe someday. Number 2. Resonance of Fate. It's nothing new for my viewers to know that I hate this game with a passion, because my expectations were high when I played it. I thought it was gonna be just a cool action RPG with a third-person shooter edition, but what I came across was probably the most overly complicated and excruciatingly painful gameplay mechanics I've ever seen in a JRPG. Made by one of my favorite developers of all time, Tri-Ace, I just can't believe they came up on drugs when they developed this preposterous title! Over the course of history, this game has gained more and more recognition, mainly thanks to its own infamy for being extremely hard to understand. My problem with it, however, it's not the learning curve. Oh no, trust me, I did understand the game. For the most part. I didn't go through 20 goddamn tutorials for nothing right after winning my first random encounter by some miracle. I don't like how the camera moves around all the time. I don't like how stiff the controls feel when you play. I don't like the main characters because I know nothing about them even after several hours of gameplay. I don't like the battle system, and I absolutely hate the maps where you need to gather hexes and put them on the floor so you can cross to a different area. All this while getting random encounters. Yeah. You know what, complicated or not, it's beside the point, but that's just personal. Overall, Resonance of Fate is a masterpiece to some and a master shit to others. But one thing we can all agree on is that it's a JRPG that's just not for everybody. Number 1. Roguelike RPGs. Oh yeah, all of them. This genre is no wonder one of the hardest video game genres ever made for many different reasons. Dungeon crawling in some of these games can be brutal even when you know what you're doing. Some of them are pretty darn good and I actually enjoy them, but some others I just turn them off after a few hours of gameplay. The reason? Different feelings, boredom and annoyance being the main ones. The point of these RPGs is to navigate through several different areas, most of them inside towers or dungeons with many floors. You gain experience as you defeat enemies in a turn-based system where the monsters move only when you move as well. Gathering items is another crucially important aspect as they can be weapons that make you stronger. However, in most of these RPGs, if you die, it's not just game over. It's back to the beginning of the game at level 1 with all items lost. Of course, some of these games are friendlier than others, but overall, they're just really hard to get into and I often debate with myself whether I should be recommending them to everybody. You really need to be a fan of this genre before you can properly enjoy it, otherwise, you'll just be tossing title after title and end up hating them all. If you want to, you can start with Azure Dreams on the PS1, some Pokemon Mystery Dungeon titles, or even Trillion God of Destruction, which is really fun and kinda different in its own genre. But no matter what, all of them will get harder and harder as you make some progress. So in the end, most roguelike RPGs are just really hard to get into, which makes them games that are just not for everybody. Okay guys, that's it. As you saw, I am a big fan of some of these games, but I'm definitely not a fan of some of the others. But like I said at the beginning, these games being good or bad is beside the point. That's just entirely your opinion, my opinion, everybody's opinion. What they all have in common is that they're just hard to get into, complicated games, not for everybody. Thanks for watching, don't forget to subscribe and share this video with your friends. See you next time!